Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Module 4's long-awaited video lecture. I apologize that this is a little late, but I had left something that I needed at work this weekend, so I wasn't able to record this weekend. And then tonight has been the joys of the end of the school year and parenting, and just it's the first moment I've gotten to sit down and record this, so I'm sorry if this is a little bit late. You'll notice that I did push back the dates for the initial response on the third question that really requires this in order to be able to answer it, to reflect that I was a day off. So a couple of quick talking points before we get started into the content tonight. First, it's kind of talking point slide, something I do in my classroom, usually every day, just where I kind of have a list of things that we need to go over administratively and things like that. So as you're working about planning your classroom management techniques, this is a nice way to set up what you need to talk to with your kids every day, just about things that they need to hear. And a lot of times students will add things they want to talk about or have questions about with long-term assignments or something else that we're doing. And it's a way to kind of bring the class together at the start of every day. So anyway, our talking points for tonight. The first one kind of is the pitfalls and benefits of the online model and the things that I'm seeing, and I'm sure you are as well. Our discussions have been excellent using the tools that we have, although I do jones badly for the opportunity to sit down around a table with all of you and just have these conversations, taking them to the next level, not having to wait 12, 24 hours to hear somebody's idea, and just to be able to continue to kind of fuel off of each other, especially as we're talking about the books. And that's showing up more and more as we get deeper into the literature of the class. But I really do want to compliment you guys on how well you've been doing with those discussions as we move forward. One of the pitfalls for me is the whole Professor Ninos thing. That would have never lasted in the real world. So at this point, if you guys are comfortable with it, can we drop that? I'll take Dave is fine. I think we're all of the same level here. Or Mr. Ninos if you need it. But the professor thing is driving me a little crazy. I know it's kind of small, but sorry, it's been something that's been bothering me. Continuing on, posting guidelines. One thing that was brought up in some of the reflection journals this week was that the posts are getting a little spread out as we're answering the individual points of each question in a separate post. Let's try to keep them condensed to one thread for each question. So the initial posters would each have their own thread, and then all the replies come underneath of those. Let's not spread it out into 2 or 3 threads for each initial poster. And that'll kind of keep the conversations grouped up a little tighter as we move forward. So just think about that as you're getting started this week. General feedback is the next thing on my list. And again, I've said it once, I'll say it again. You guys are doing a wonderful job with the conversations that we're seeing. I think this last module was much better presented from you all than modules 2 and 1. You guys are really getting into the swing of how this is going to work, and I hope you're enjoying yourselves and enjoying the conversations about the literature. Looking ahead, and notice I said we're way ahead of ourselves. Module 6 is a 2-week module, and that's where you guys are going to be looking at literature circles. That's the week that I will be in Europe, so I just wanted to kind of put that in your heads right now as we're working towards that module, that I'm going to be out of touch, especially as you guys are working on those 2 weeks, and just to kind of give you a heads up that that's coming. So I will have internet access over there, but how often and how much is of dubious amounts, we're not sure. So I will definitely be in touch, but I'm not sure how much connected I will be. Next piece on here is the philosophy paper draft. Please remember to be working on that. I know one came in the other day, and I'm going to start giving feedback on those. I'm going to use a web-based program called Vocaroo, which I will send you a link when I send you your feedback on your paper, and it will be me talking to you about your paper as opposed to just giving you a markup on the page. So that will be coming to you probably within this week or into next. My last note is there are some notes from the field. I'm wrapping up the school year this week, and I just want to let you all know how totally rewarding the end of a school year can be, to listen to your kids talk about what they've learned, talk about what they've enjoyed, to talk about how the year has changed them, and to see them and the growth that they've gone through. It truly is the biggest job in the world, ladies. I really look forward to seeing your thoughts on it as you get out into the field next year and get to experience all these great things that are going on. I will tell you one of the hardest parts about teaching I was thinking of today as I was talking to some of my students. You spend all year getting to know these kids and really becoming friends with them in a strange way. And then you're asked to let them go at the end of the year. It can be very difficult, and the bittersweet end to a school year is always kind of tough. So without any further ado, let me get my mug off the screen. No booked shirt. I'm wearing a Star Wars t-shirt this evening. Same glass of red wine as last time. Well, not the same glass, but the same red wine as last time. And doing this in style, as they say. All right, so here we go. Module 4, Deep Discussions about Literature, Talking with Students about Theme. I've just read a slide to you. There's some good instructional quality for you guys. Today we're going to talk a little bit about big questions and big questions in teaching. And as we look at the big questions, this is something that was much more prevalent, curricularly speaking, about 5 or 6 years ago before we moved into No Child Left Behind, which then went into Common Core. However, it's still at the root of what we should be doing. And you'll address your curriculum, and I'm sure as you get your curriculum and you see some of these lessons, you'll address the individual lessons and the individual standards that are brought out. But the question I would always encourage you as a teacher to continue to deal with are those big questions, really making that literature matter for our students beyond just using it as a tool to teach skills. When we talk about big questions, we're talking about things that we can talk about before, during, and after reading. The things that are going to engage with our students and let them have those conversations about the literature beyond what's just in the book. And those big questions, they're the life questions. They're the kind of questions that allow us to connect to that larger universe, the music of the spheres, if you will. The idea of what life is outside of the confines of the book itself. And if we aren't asking these kind of questions about literature with our kids, then what are we doing? Are we simply teaching skills? Are we simply teaching comprehension? We know that that doesn't create a good reader. We know that that creates a technician. It doesn't create a person who's able to question, who's able to challenge. So we have to think about it. If we're not asking our kids the big questions, then what really are we doing? Why aren't we doing it? Is it a matter of fear? Are we afraid of what might come out of those conversations? I will tell you, the things we're going to talk about tonight can spiral out of control in a classroom if you're not careful as a teacher and you don't manage your conversations. That can be scary. Sometimes a lesson can take on a life of its own, and you have to really work and manage to control that and make sure it's doing what you want it to do. Is it a fear that your students might not participate? Is it a fear that you might ask one of those big questions and then have your classroom in the dreadful silence where they all just stare at you? And that comes down to comfort zones. Can we create an environment in our classroom where our students are comfortable talking about big things about life? And this is another whole topic that we could spend hours upon hours talking about. But the idea of how are we going to build an environment in our classroom where it's okay to be honest, it's okay to be wrong, and it's also okay to disagree with each other. That environment comes from trust. That environment comes from getting to know your students. That environment comes from being open about your own feelings and thoughts and failures, being able to admit that you too can be wrong, being able to say things to your students in total honesty and have them feel safe in that conversation. And while I'm not going to spend too much time on that tonight, as you're writing your philosophy papers, think about that. How are you going to create that environment where it's okay to be honest, it's okay to be wrong, and it's okay to disagree? So as we're talking about some of those big questions, I want to give you some examples and talk about how I've used them in my classroom. And I'm actually pulling from some curricular novels that I've taught over the last 5 or 6 years and looking at some of the questions I've put in front of my classes, both standard and gifted classes, to prepare to talk about books and before we actually dive into them. And the first examples are things I use with my standard classes, talking about Midsummer Night's Dream. So just some of the questions that I started out were, do you agree or do you disagree with these 3 statements? There is no such thing as true love. We should temper our actions to make others happy, or it is good to think highly of yourself at all times. These are incredible conversation starters. When you can get a 13 or 14-year-old to start having these conversations, to offer up their opinions, to challenge them to express things that they've seen in their own lives, things that they've seen in media, things that they've heard to help support or go against these. This gets them in the mindset to prepare to read that Shakespearean play, to get them to talk about their concepts on true love. Well, is there true love? Does love truly exist? That's a tough question to ask in a middle school English classroom. But as you get your kids to talk about it, they're thinking before they ever even touch that book, before they ever even hear the name Hermia or Lysander, or they ever even look at that strange relationship between Oberon and his queen. Those questions help get the book going, getting things flowing a little bit. That question about tempering our actions to make others happy. When Hermia sits and talks to her father in Act 1, Scene 1 of that play, kids see themselves if they've walked through these questions and they've thought about these things, and they start to ask, do I do things to make my parents happy, my teachers happy? Is that necessarily the right thing? Having that conversation with them beforehand helps them connect to those characters. jump to our next work. This year I had the pleasure of teaching The Princess Bride to my GT classes, the novel, not the movie, although we did watch big chunks of the movie just to enjoy how it was converted. Little known fact, Goldman actually wrote the book and the script to the movie, so it's one of those rare examples where I think the movie actually is an improvement upon the text in places, but I digress. So here are some of the examples that we led off with on The Princess Bride, and for those of you not familiar with the story, I highly recommend it. But just a couple questions that we started, and this was a whole period in our class this year, to sit and talk about these ideas about revenge. And of course, they, strangely enough, had never heard of the story before for the majority of my class, and they had some wonderful thoughts and ideas on what revenge could do to a person, and they supported it anecdotally. This is what I've seen in my friends who've tried to get revenge, and some of them dug into texts that they read before, or TV shows that they've watched, and they were able to paint a very good picture of the effects of revenge on people before they ever heard of Inigo Montoya, and what he would have to go through in order to find the six-fingered man who killed his father. Some other questions on here. Brains beat brawn every time. Being beautiful is incredibly important. Oh, we spent a long time on this as my 8th grade girls went off and talked much about expectations and the way they feel and how they are judged. And it was a fascinating conversation. And as you get into the book in the early chapters and Goldman talks about Buttercup's beauty, it opened up a whole new realm of analysis for us as we talked about what really mattered and what was really important to these characters and to Goldman himself. Good stories need happy endings. If you've ever read The Princess Bride, not watched the movie, the ending is ambiguous to say the least. And this was another good conversation about stories and their endings and what we expect to see and how they pertain to life and how they pertain to theme. If an author does not give us a happy ending, what's he trying to say about what's going on in the story? Of course, we talked about sarcasm and humor. And look at the next one there about making fun of things. Then we had this next question about true love that will stop at nothing to be realized. It was a fascinating conversation to hear teenagers talk about their views on love and what true love could really mean. They were a very sarcastic bunch this year as we hit these. And you can see the other ones that are on there. These were all just great guiding conversation questions, and we sat in a circle and we discussed them and we debated them, and they bounced ideas off of each other, and I would ask more questions to expand them, and that helped them get an idea of what we were doing going into the book. There's a unit I taught on greatness in the last couple of years, both with my standard and my GT. It's a parallel unit, and instead of using big questions, I gave them some quotes. And you can see the quotes that I used on there. I won't read them all to you. But I asked them, which of these quotes do you agree with? Which are the ones that are the strongest? Which are the ones that you feel really speak to this concept of being great? And one of the culminating assignments when they were done with this was to use the quotes to create a definition of greatness that we could apply to both historical figures and fictional characters. The ideas here in these quotes really forced them to ask the question over what it meant to be great. We learned to drop morality in our conversations about greatness as we were getting into a book on the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. It was a nonfiction piece, but we still talked about how someone could be great but not be good. And it was a fascinating conversation as we continued on from there. This is from my intro lesson to Tale of Two Cities last year. I didn't teach this year. But I want you to see the level of the questioning here. And these are 8th graders that I use these with. And these are the questions that we talked about as we led into Dickens's book. And again, some incredible conversations as we got into things. And this was a text that none of them had any clue about as they were going in. They knew none of the leading facts behind some of these conversations. But again, these were agrees and disagrees. And as we started the conversation going into the book, and we actually wrote on a lot of these moving forward, it really helped them build up with what would become a very difficult piece of literature and trying to understand what Dickens was saying. And not only what Dickens was saying, but for their own interactions, that very personal connection that we want to have our students have with a piece of text. And doing these kind of questions as we led in really helped them connect with that. My favorite on here, and probably one of the most fascinating conversations I've ever had with students, was number 14. It's easy to tell people that you love them versus 15, where it's easy to talk about how much you hate something, was a great conversation that we had and led into some very interesting thoughts from these kids about how much they spend complaining about things and they don't tell the people who matter what really happens. It ended up with my class actually saying that we loved each other in school one day. It was a fascinating conversation as these 14-year-olds were looking at each other and saying, I never told you this before, but in a non-creepy way, guys, I love you all. And it was a very cool conversation. And as we worked our way through Tale of Two Cities, that conversation kept coming back up. And in a way, it allowed them to connect to Sidney Carton so that that last scene, oh, I'll tell you, if you ever get to teach Dickens, there will not be a dry eye in the house when you get to that last scene. There's a far, far better thing. Oh, next slide. So with those in mind, what are the qualities of a good discussion? I've watched young teachers really struggle over the years with trying to figure out how to make good discussion work in their classroom. And like I said, it is a very hairy proposition to go forward and work on something like this and to manage to balance everything. But the benefits are huge. The benefits are incredible to see what kids get out of that good academic conversation. Again, I'm not going to go too far into in this class some of the techniques for conversation. There are a lot of them out there. Socratic seminar versus fishbowl versus four corners discussions and things like that. But at the end of the day, the qualities of a good discussion matter more than those different techniques. I observed a lesson earlier this year. It was a fishbowl lesson. And for those of you not familiar with fishbowl, the idea is that the discussion goes on the inside of a circle while the kids on the outside are coaching those on the inside. It's a neat idea in theory. But I watched a lesson this year, a younger teacher who had put together a fishbowl conversation, and the kids were so focused on the process of the fishbowl that nothing was actually discussed. They were just busy making sure that they took care of their fishbowl responsibilities as opposed to having good, deep conversations. And sometimes when I'm looking at a conversation in my classroom, it's not particularly pretty. Those are not necessarily days that I would want someone to come in and observe my teaching, because those conversations are often heated, they are often loud, they are often humorous, but they are good because we're getting into that deep core questioning about life. So the first thing I want to throw out there is whenever you're going to talk with kids, and this be a college classroom, if we were getting together to talk, you need a physical space that's conducive to talking. Sitting in rows with somebody in the front does not work. Now, this is not my classroom, although that mural on the back wall makes me a little jealous. You can see that? That's pretty impressive. But again, notice the circle. Notice that the kids are all looking at each other and able to have a conversation. Probably once a week, twice a week in my classes, we move the desks and we circle up our chairs so that we can all sit and see each other and discuss things, whether it's something we're reading, whether it's our homework from the night before. But that physical space is conducive to talking. It's conducive to seeing people. It's conducive to having to make eye contact with your peers. Hard to hide in a circle. The other key thing is here, place yourself inside that circle. Take yourself away from a position of power if you're having a good discussion with your students. You should not appear to be at the quote-unquote head of the table in these types of discussions. You're a member of the group. You're one who is sitting there asking questions and listening, making sure that the students are not directing their conversation to you but to each other. And that circle can help facilitate that. So the qualities of a good discussion with your students. Once you get that physical space set up, have to think about, we want active listening in our students. And we have to talk about, before you even begin to discuss, what does active listening look like? It's eye contact. It's responding both physically and verbally to your peers. It is taking notes sometimes in a conversation. Sometimes it's simply interjecting to say, oh, I hear what you're saying, or I agree with you. And that goes on to our next one. Affirming ideas. It's okay to, in a conversation, to say, hey, I heard what Emmy was saying, and I really agree with what she has to say. Kate, I really liked what you said here. Active participation. Ideally, we want all of our students to participate. Ideally, we want our students to be a part of that conversation. Sometimes your job as a teacher is going to be to call and ask students who might not feel comfortable and kind of cajole them to just simple questions. Do you agree with what Lily said? Do you agree with what Emily just put on the table here? And just getting them to say yes or no will show that they're being a part of that conversation. Good discussion has students piggybacking off of other people's ideas. This is something that we can teach. I really liked what Kate said when she talked about the theme in the book. However, I think that while Kate thinks that the theme has to do with this, and on and on and on, teaching our students that way makes the discussion tighter. It weaves that fabric a little closer together so that we have those good conversations. Asking questions. When we talk in a conversation, it shouldn't simply be, hey, this is what I think, period. It should be, what do you guys think about this? Of course, this is Socrates, and if you've read your Socrates, you understand the methods of Socratic inquisition. The idea of constantly working with those questions and building on those questions, that's what leads to a good discussion as well. I always challenge my students to ask questions of each other, not just of me, to continue to get them to talk about the book, continue to grow these ideas. The next one on there is also huge, just complimenting each other. Wow, great point, Lily. I just want to say I really enjoyed that. Abby, that was a wonderful thought that you had there. Miranda, you really knocked that one out of the park. But let me ask you this, and having that kind of continue to grow the conversation. And then finally, having good examples. One thing I always challenge in big conversations with my classes is, are you referencing things that we've read? Are you referencing conversations that we've had? Are you able to tap into that huge bank of knowledge that we've built throughout the year to help continue to grow our ideas and conversations? You need to give your class time to chew, both before and after a good discussion. A lot of times those things that you saw earlier there, I'll give them to them the night before with the homework assignment of kind of jot some thoughts down. Take your writer's journal, get some ideas together, or maybe pick the one that you're the most passionate about and develop an argument so you're ready to talk the next day. Some people are very good at talking on the spot. Other people really need to prepare, and you need to give your students opportunity for that. But also afterwards, once the conversation is over, don't let it just be done. Don't let it fade away. Have them pick one of those statements, one of those big questions, and just write a response to it. Maybe write a response that they give to one of their classmates instead of you. Maybe write a response to the whole class. I think I've told you guys already, I make use of an online discussion board for my classes. So after one of these big conversations, we'll usually just open up a conversation topic and allow people to kind of summarize their thoughts of the day. This is great because of that last bullet point. It gives those quiet students an opportunity to respond in a format that isn't the discussion circle. While we want all of our kids to participate, let's be honest, some people don't feel comfortable in that format, and also you will be dealing with classes of 30 plus students. Sometimes not everybody gets to speak in that format. But having a way where everyone can reflect on that discussion and you can get to read and understand what's going on, that's powerful. Especially if it's a way that the whole class can see what the other people thought. That's even more powerful. And with the technology that's out there today, there are a lot of opportunities to do that. You can even go low tech and post them up around the classroom the next day. But the idea of having that outcome for all the students to be there, I think, is one of the qualities that makes a very good conversation. So while I'm talking about these big questions, these deep questions, these life questions, we're really having a discussion about theme and those literary discussions about theme. And theme is probably one of the hardest things for adolescents to really put their finger on. I'm sure it was for you guys when you were growing up. I know I struggled with it back in middle school. Let's look at some definitions of theme. The two on the left are mine, and the two on the right are from various texts. You'll see on the right-hand side, the main idea or underlying meaning of a work, a subject of discourse. And on my side, I have the author's message about life, the big ideas of a work. What are we talking about here? What is the underlying power behind this piece of literature, this piece of music, this piece of art, this piece of poetry? And before I get too far into theme, I will tell you, I teach theme outside of literature quite often with my students. We analyze artwork and we talk about what themes the artist is trying to develop and how we can figure that out, forcing them to think different side of the brain, trying to pull things together. We'll look at music and we'll try to analyze it. You haven't lived until you've taught an entire class of 14-year-olds to analyze the theme of Taylor Swift's music. Beautiful lesson. You should try it sometime. It's great. But again, using them, these different types of media, for they can see theme being spread out and where it can show up. So if we look at those definitions and we can hold on to them, I'm going to use mine, the one I use with my kids, the author's message about life. What is this author trying to say about that human condition? We talked about that at our first meeting, and it's not too big to ask your students to think about. What is the author really trying to say about what it means to be a person? So we talk about theme, we can talk about first universal themes. These are your big ideas. They're one or two words, powerful words, usually nouns. These are the giant idea nets. Universal should mean universal. They should be applicable, to all people, all cultures, all historical periods. This is a great way to ground your study of some of those classics that we've talked about. The themes that Shakespeare writes about are the themes of today. How can you look at Shakespeare's work and not see the same things that we struggle with today? How can you look at Jane Austen and not see the same romantic struggles that our students are going to be facing in their own time? How can you not look at Lowry, even though it was written in the 90s, and not see these big questions about society and government that we are struggling with so very clearly today. You can see some examples over there of universal theme: love, loss, honor, family, friendship, perseverance, greatness. Finding different art forms to talk about the theme of love can be incredibly rewarding in your classroom. Find poetry, find music, find visual art, find a movie clip where we look at that idea of this theme being developed, especially with older students. It makes it very clear that the themes can stretch across all sorts of different art. Specific theme, once we've identified universal or general theme, is kind of what is the author's message then about that big idea. This is the traditional theme statement. What does the author believe about, fill in the universal theme here? What is the author's thought on love? What is the author's thought on family? What is the author's thought? And again, this is going to be inferred. This is going to be coming from the students' support from the text or support from the artwork that they're working with, but giving them an idea of saying this is what the author's trying to tell us. So let's talk about teaching theme a little bit. And we're going to do this with fairy tales because they're pretty obvious. And one of the ways I like to think about theme personally is I'm trying to get my head wrapped around it to teach it. And it's a very difficult concept and very abstract for a lot of kids. Theme is the outcome of all the other literary elements. When you smoosh, technical term, smoosh, all of those literary elements together, what comes out of the other end of the equation is a theme. Inferences made on the results of the character while interacting with the plot against the qualifying ideas of the setting. I wrote that one. It's totally convoluted. I would never say that to students, but I think if you look at it as an English major, it kind of makes a pretty good statement on what theme really is. The idea that we are making inferences based upon what happens to the character while faced with the problem that they're facing. Okay, so the character did this. This happened in the story because of the problem that's going on. And of course, all that happens against the panoramic background of the setting, where and when the story is taking place and what we know about that period. The inferences that are required to put together theme are some very high-level abstract thinking. If you're working with middle school students, specifically 6th graders, 7th graders, developmentally, they might not quite be ready to put those things together. They might really need some help as they're thinking that abstractly, but they will be able to do it with your assistance. So let's talk about Little Red Riding Hood. I directed Into the Woods this year, so I talked a lot about fairy tales in my classes just because they were on my mind. And Little Red is a great place to talk about theme. So let's look at our narrative elements. Characters in the story. We have Little Red. We have the wolf. We have Little Red's parents. Great parenting that they do. We have Granny, who lives alone in the wolf-infested woods. Location. And in the original Grimm fairy tale version of it, we do have the woodsman or the huntsman that comes at the end of the story and saves Little Red. The setting of the story. The home of Little Red Riding Hood. The woods into which she enters, which is an archetypal setting, of course. And then we have Granny's cottage at the heart of the woods. So what's the plot? Little Red Riding Hood goes to Mom. I want to go visit Granny. She's not feeling well. Mom says, great, here, take this food, this sustenance, this stuff from our safe home. You're going to take it to Granny. And what you need to do, Little Red, is make sure that you stay on the path. Okay, Mom, I hear you. Sounds like a great plan. I'm heading off into the woods to go visit Granny. Little Red heads into the woods. She starts to walk down the path, but depending on the version of the story, one thing or another catches her attention and pulls her not just from the path, but from the words that her parents gave her. Of course, off the path, she meets the wolf. She talks to him. She is mesmerized by him in some versions of the story, and one way or the other, she gives up that information. She gives up where she is heading. Of course, the rest of the story goes on. Little Red shows up at Granny's house. Knock, knock, knock. Oh, my Granny, what big ears you have, what big claws you have, what big teeth you have, what a mean digestive system you have, and I just got eaten. So people die at the end of this story. In the Grimm's version, the woodsman comes and slices open the belly of the beast and pulls Granny and Little Red from the wolf. And there you have the plot of Little Red Riding Hood. So let's think about theme for a few minutes. There's a very clear message being sent here by the writers of this story, this classic story that was used to teach to our students, to teach to our young people what it meant to not be safe. You know, when you go into the woods, that strange place that's dark and wild, you have to beware. You have to stay on the path. You have to not talk to strangers. You have to do what you're told. Now let's look at how that gets brought out. Little Red goes into the woods. Her mother says, hey, don't talk to strangers. Little Red does, and what is the outcome? Well, the outcome is she gets eaten. I can't think of a more negative outcome to prove the theme than being eaten alive. Not a good thing that happens. So the message here, quite honestly, is, hey, obviously, I need to listen to my parents. It's a specific theme. General theme being what? Right and wrong, safety. General themes that fairy tales were preaching hundreds of years ago to teach children about the dangers of not listening. I think Little Red is fascinating too because we still show the young people of the era, when these stories were written, that it will be okay. You can screw up because adults will be around to save you. And that's another theme that gets developed here. When the woodsman comes and saves Little Red and Granny, there is someone there to save you. There will be people to help you. There will be people to guide you. And this is a thematic analysis of this story. When you're teaching theme, break out the fairy tales. It's so obvious. It's right on top. You can talk about theme with the students and have them analyze things, talk about the symbolism behind them. With older students, I think you can talk a lot about the symbolism of this is a young lady who is going out into the wild and makes these decisions. And this was what they were trying to make the point to the people who were listening to the stories about how to carry yourself at the time period. And of course, putting that up against the setting so that you understand when these were written and who they were written for. So this week we're going to work with those big questions. We're going to work with theme, and we're going to really kind of delve into these things as we look at Lowry's work. The Giver is a very powerful piece of literature. It has big questions that need to be asked, and I hope that as you guys are working with the book, you'll be thinking about those big questions. So let's not be afraid to go deep into that book this week and have those big conversations. I have my own set that I've taught with before for The Giver, and I'll have those off to the side, but I'm really interested to see what you generate. We're also going to be creating a list of universal themes, those big one-worders, right, common to young adult literature. Let's see if we can build that out of our own experiences with young adult books and things that we can have together. Hope you guys have enjoyed this. Hasn't been too dry, and I will talk to you soon.